I've been working to keep holy awareness through the week when the week of living goes all kinds of directions. Looking at the text and the hard and holy work through the week, there are some places that I've stopped and looked more carefully to ask myself the questions. 4 things happen in this very short text. First, Moses winds up killing an Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Second, Moses comes to the defense of 7 daughters who shepherds are keeping from being able to water their sheep. Then there's a father who can't understand why daughters have forgotten hospitality to a stranger traveler, especially when the person has been kind to them. And finally, there is a father who gives Moses one of the daughters as wife, and she gives Moses a son. That made me realize that Moses did not think he was going anywhere. He says he was an alien and a foreigner, without a community or history. He was starting a new life, a new community, a new history. So let's go back to number 1. To see the reason this event is in Hebrew Scriptures, we need to understand their ideas from the 10 Commandments. Our translations of the 10 Commandments for centuries said, "Do not kill." But the Hebrew word means murder. There's a difference. In the early stages of civilization, laying down rules about taking a human life took a while to distinguish that difference. Along the way, an eye for an eye came along. It was progress. It was a prohibition against escalations. It put limits on retaliation. It was a step toward corrective justice. You pay as much as the innocent person lost. You don't get more. Moses was trying to save a human life from a deadly beating. It really didn't matter whether the victim was innocent or not. He was supposed to stop a murder. Every do not implies a do. Any parent who keeps telling their children to quit something without telling them what they need to do is leaving a lot of useful lessons off the table and leaving the child pretty much in the dark. Moses was trying to save a human life from a deadly beating. It really did not matter if the person was innocent, and he was trying to do a good thing, not a bad thing. In this room, we need to focus more on the good than on the bad, the positive more than the negative, the needed behaviors more than the judgmental dismissals. So the commentary on this first point. What happens when a society spends time, money, and energy, a lot of money, punishing people who do something wrong without helping them learn to do the right thing? I would love to have a week with some politicians and ask them why they think education is a waste of money. If they think punishment for bad behaviors will change anyone, do they need to be put in a prison because they abuse human lives? The United States has the highest rate of prison population in the world. It has the highest rate of return to prison in the world. Texas has 135,000 people in a prison at the end of 2023. Oh, and also, they have another 100,000 on parole, and they have 330,000 people on probation. That all adds up to about 571,000 people who are in the Texas criminal post-trial population. We've largely turned prison management over to private businesses to save money. And we don't spend much money supervising their work. And we don't even want to go toward looking at the statistics on economic class and ethnic racial disparities in the prison populations. So why should I go to the trouble of these numbers when statistics can always lie about anything? Because we actually know that the expense of criminal justice system is directly related to the lack of expense in medical and mental health, in education and job training. Why the example of prisons with fostering human living? Why would I choose that? Well, in the first century, Christians who were serving the least were told, I was in prison and you visited me. Ironically, there were a lot of Christians in prison, including a guy named Paul. Calvin was not by any means the first to say that negative statements in the Ten Commandments also have implicit positive commands. Do not murder is the minimum of the commandment to protect and foster human life. The theological way to say it is the sacredness of human life. It's simple cause and effect. If as a society we don't foster all human life and you intentionally strategize to neglect minorities and the poor, you're not killing people physically, but you're murdering them socially and morally. So the application. What is a positive thing for us to do? This week, you can ask every friend, every work colleague, your family members, the church members, and I'm doing it right now, have you voted yet? Are you going to vote? Have you found a guide from a trusted source that you can copy down the names of the people that you don't know that you need to vote for? My problem with any legislature has nothing to do with party politics. It has everything to do with all of the parties and the Ten Commandments. We Christians are commanded to preserve human life as sacred. A king's order to kill Moses on sight would advance the king's purposes. It was murder, just as much as what Rob Mueller has personally witnessed 3 different times on the west side, one time on the street beside the church. Or what the police chief of San Antonio says happens on the southeast side more often than on the west side. And until a bond got passed, there wasn't even a hope of a police station in the southeast side district. Doing nothing does not protect innocent life. Faithfulness requires us to do what we can whenever we see an opportunity. Rob Mueller saw an opportunity, and his lesson with gun violence and those t-shirts teaches us talking about guns all the time is good for the profits of the gun industry. Our conversations need to start and continue talking about the loss of sacred human lives to needless gunfire. The second point in my bold print for the week, Moses and this defense of 7 daughters. They are innocent too, but they're overlooked. Women herding sheep, going for water, meant there were no men in the family to do it, and probably no money to hire them. The shepherds running them off, probably every day, was fun for the shepherds and an injustice to the women. Moses is a stranger, and the daughters are so shocked that a stranger who looks like an Egyptian foreigner would defend them that they forget to offer him the hospitality required for them in their faith, their father's priest faith. I won't go into the long analysis over this commentary at the point, but I'll say that discrimination because of sexual orientation, to me, seems primarily done by a bunch of men with power and privilege who don't want to lose any money, because after all, it's always about the economy. So the commentary. We are commanded to foster innocent life, and that also means livelihood. If a person of any sexual orientation is paying another person less for the same work because they have a different sexual orientation, they're not only disobeying the law, they are sinning. Sexuality is an attribute that everyone who is essentially a sacred human being that we should treasure. So, application. Well, what should we do? Well, if we see an instance of this, we should first ask the offender what church they go to. And then ask if Jesus would endorse the practices of their business. Would Jesus endorse the practice in the businesses you work in? Then we might help that person who suffers the indignity to find a good Christian attorney. If we hear about things, if we see things, we need to not ignore them. We're not going to solve all those great big problems, but we have to solve the problems that are right in front of us. And we need to celebrate the decent companies who do the hard work that may not be considered holy in this room, but it's still the justice work. Companies like the one my daughter gets to work for, HEB. You know, the guy that started that company, was one of those old-time conservative Christians, and he sowed into it a DNA that is still there. The third point, hospitality to a stranger. In a nomadic world, a wilderness is a desert. And desert environments mean death. And if you don't help a stranger in the desert, it means murder. Overlooking an innocent person because you're afraid of a foreigner was a sin in most religions, including Egyptian religion and Hebrew religion and the priest religion. It still is. Most people who are trying to immigrate are not criminals in spite of some people's opinions. A lot of them are trying to escape a criminal drug culture. The problem is big and it's complicated, but the bigger problem is the cause of the problem for us in the long neglect of addressing it. The children in the wire cages on the border are overlooked innocents. A vote is a stand. It's something we can do. Talking about human lives of children is more than a start. Obviously, We need police, and we need prisons, and we need armies to protect innocent lives, including our own. But we need to support government and nonprofit and religious organizations who serve people who are strangers to us because we don't live in that part of town. Christian Assistance Ministry, CAM, SAM, San Antonio Metropolitan Ministries, both of whom were started by a Presbyterian church in its better days, have been helping the least for decades with real expertise. Giving money to the homeless guy on the street is co-enabling his answer that is not any solution for him. Giving to a trusted agency like we do here at the church, or giving to the church so that we can give more. Our budget literally, largely, limits us to covering our overhead, and sometimes really does not do that. We want to do more. The only limit we have is not having the money to do more. It's like the chairman of a stewardship committee in another church said at a session meeting one night, "At this church, we don't have an expense problem. We have a contribution problem. We need more money to do more good." Turning social witness into action for the least means helping to finance the people who know more about it than we do. So finally, that part about Moses, the price he had paid for not overlooking an innocent person, was losing his identity. He was an alien in a foreign land, a Hebrew identified as an Egyptian, a nomad known as a stranger, an innocent man fleeing a king who wanted to murder him. In the 1970s, a prophet named Harvey Cox at Harvard Divinity School wrote a book called The Secular City. The major theme was the prediction that modern life would create an isolation of the individual, a separation of the culture from a larger sense of obligation to ethical rules and responsibility for behaviors, especially responsibility to others. He was one of the first to talk about urban stratification strategies that would put the poor in neglected neighborhoods and leave them there. He could have known about San Antonio in the 1950s, putting all of the Mexicans in a village on the outside edge of town, naming the streets north and south by cities in Mexico, and naming the river and naming the east-west ones by Spanish names, so they would feel comfortable and at home in their poverty. As Henry Cisneros, the former governor who was born in that barrio, said at an HNS lunch a couple of weeks ago, if you want to see what it was like then there are places still where you can just drive down the street and imagine what it's always been. Divine Redeemer Presbyterian Church and the House of Neighborly Service have been there since about 1915 in the middle of that neighborhood. They do more than imagine, and we can help them work at it. In our calendar, it's Lent, and we need to think and do more than think about where we are headed if we follow him. We are in the holy room that is the counterculture and the salvation of the individual isolation and the loss of community and the lack of common value orientation and the neglect of others in need. We are the support for the sacredness of human living that responds to sacred needs. We are here for the people who are not here yet. Here we do the holy work that keeps us true and points us in Christ's direction. And we know that holy awareness is the hard work of looking past our horizon and making sure that the innocent don't get abused by people who think it's fun. Amen.